I see the light at the end of the tunnel for my work on the King James. I don't know exactly what I'm predicting, how long it will take for the train to hit me and end my misery and yours, or for me to emerge on the other side of the tunnel in the bright, sunlit uplands of other nerdy Bible topics. But I spent some focused time in prayer on a little retreat with my wife recently, and the main thing I was asking the Lord for was direction for my work on YouTube. I had hit a low spot. I'm prepared to say that I don't think I'll go on forever about King James Onlyism. I want to get 100 false friends, make a smattering of other videos along the way, and move on to other Bible translation topics sometime in this calendar year. Another reason I don't think I will go on about the King James indefinitely, I just don't see my Christian opponents in the King James debate really listening to me and responding. So I, in turn, don't have to make the kinds of refinements to my viewpoint that come when you engage in disputes with intelligent people who disagree. I'm running out of points to respond to, and I'm running out of things that truly need to be said, in my humble opinion, about King James readability, or at least things that I'm capable of saying, given that my abilities lie far more in words than in syntax. With rare exceptions, my Christian opponents say the same things to me over and over. I make the same counter-arguments over and over. I literally have keyboard shortcuts for these counter-arguments, and I use them over and over. They go silent over and over. I recognize that some of them might say that about me, though I tend to think that's because I refuse to engage them on textual criticism until they respond to what I'm saying about readability. You'll have to listen to both sides and decide who's right. Well, one of those rare exceptions has occurred, sort of. I got a very intelligent reply to my arguments about King James readability from a man by the name of Thomas Ross. Some of what he said I have already responded to elsewhere and will therefore omit in this 3-video response, but he came up with, depending on how you count, 7 newish arguments that I haven't heard. A few are refinements of existing arguments, a few are truly brand new, and I'm saving those for the final video. As soon as I saw Ross's video, I knew I just had to sit down and do some homework in order to respond to him. The reason I said sort of is this: Ross wasn't actually responding to me, but to James White, with whom he'd had a debate. But Ross is the right-hand man of another very intelligent King James Onlyist, Kent Brandenburg. And Kent saw what I saw, that Ross's response to White applies to my work too. Here's what Kent said. Perhaps we could take a moment regarding this presentation with consideration of the Mark Ward intelligibility argument. What Thomas Ross asserts makes sense, fits the King James translators to the readers, and is in line with a scriptural mindset concerning formal equivalence. It suitably answers the Ward criticism and hopefully puts it to rest. So I think Ross's view is worthy of response by me. He actually makes new arguments, again, that I haven't heard before, something I don't believe Kent has done over the years. Thomas Ross invited me to debate him once, actually, but I declined. And I need to state this sad truth here. I regard Ross as an extremist of a particularly dangerous kind, the kind that is super intelligent. And I and my counselors are not convinced that a live debate with an extremist fits my gifts and my purposes in all this work on the King James. But he is certainly knowledgeable in the realm of biblical studies, and you're going to see that, and that's why he landed a debate with James White. To be clear, the video that you will see me excerpt from is Thomas Ross, making follow-up comments to his debate with James White. He starts by quoting White.
So let us look at the level of language difficulty in the KJV. Dr. White claimed 13 minutes into our debate that, quote, translations should be in the common language, understandable and accessible, just as the original preaching was in ancient days. The idea of having a translation that is not in the language of the people is the exact opposite of the perspective that they, namely the KJV translators, had.
This is the claim made by White that Ross is responding to in this video of his. And of course, I agree with White rather profoundly. The King James translators intended to translate the Bible into the language of the people. This claim is worth some nuancing, which Ross will helpfully force us to do. But fundamentally, the viewpoint that drives me on this channel is White's. So when Ross responds to White, he is ipso facto, presto changeo, where's Waldo, responding to me. Let's take time to listen to Ross's new and newish arguments. I'll do 3 in this video, 2 in the next, and 2 in the final video. First, Ross argues that there's a difference between the King James being in the language of the common people and being understandable by the common people. The substance here isn't really new. I hear this all the time. It's akin to the claim that the King James uses biblical English and therefore can't and shouldn't be revised. But the angle is new. Ross is using the preface to attribute some intentionality to the King James translators that I have not seen before.
Now, notice, please, first of all, that the KJV never said that it was in the language of the common, the very vulgar. It said it wanted the common people to understand it. The KJV rejected the Roman Catholic practice of deliberately making Scripture hard to understand. However, the KJV retained old ecclesiastical words which were not very likely to be used regularly by commoners. It avoided the obscurantism and deliberate difficulty of a Catholicism that wanted to conceal the meaning of Scripture from the people, while also retaining some language that was above the level of ordinary speech for the sake of accuracy and precision. Such ecclesiastical words might not have been in daily use by common people, but they could be understood by common people. An important distinction.
There are two major aspects of King James English that were indeed passing out of common speech in 1611, but still understood by the common people. These should not be hard to grasp because this situation remains basically the same today. Those two major elements were archaic second-person pronoun forms, such as thee and ye, and archaic verb endings like est and eth, like speakest and speaketh. Those forms were actively fading away in the English of the early 1600s. They weren't being used, or not much, and yet people could understand them, as they generally can today. The influence of Shakespeare and the King James have helped keep those forms at the edge of our English, but on a stable place on that edge. I think it is easy to learn the these and thous and the verb suffixes like testifieth. I did this intuitively when I was a kid. I think most people do. I need to admit that I don't know for certain why those forms were retained in the King James, even when they were passing out of the language during the time it was being translated. I have publicly guessed that it was just too much work to revise them all. The King James translators were revising the 1568 Bishop's Bible, marking it up word by word on paper copies with notations. It would have been a major hassle to have to adjust all of the these and thous and ye's and you's. Ross, equally, however, does not know that the King James translators made this choice in order to keep the King James in a high English or a biblical English, as King James defenders frequently like to say. What we do know is what they said in their preface, and they said that they wanted Scripture to speak like itself as in the language of Canaan. I've puzzled over this phrase in the King James preface. I'm not perfectly certain what it means. The best I can guess is that the King James translators want the Bible that they're translating to speak to its English readers in just the same way as it spoke to its original Hebrew and Greek readers. And that brings me to the actual words at issue in the King James debate, because I'm not disputing that lots of English speakers today can understand quite well the two categories of archaism that I've mentioned, thee and thou and the, doeth and doest. Here's my question. What about the many, many other archaisms in the King James that people in 1611 could understand and people today cannot? What about the dead words, beeves and bold and bewrayed, and false friends, halt, remove, commend, that I go on and on about on this channel? The sometimes difficult syntax and punctuation of the King James I'll leave aside, lest this video get too complex. I'm not very good at talking about them anyway. Does the fact that the King James translators allowed two major categories of archaic but understandable forms to remain in their translation, does that mean they'd be happy with a situation in which the very vulgar of today can no longer fully understand what they read because of the many, many ways in which language change has affected English? I think not. I disagree violently with the idea that because the King James translators used some words that might not have been in daily use by common people but could be understood by common people, that therefore the King James translators would defend Ross's refusal to update the dead words and false friends. I just don't see an intentional distinction in the King James preface between the language of the common people and language that can be understood by common people. I see in the preface instead some pretty broad commitments to using language that the regular common people can understand. Translation it is that openeth the window to let in the light, that breaketh the shell that we may eat the kernel, that putteth aside the curtain that we may look into the most holy place, that removeth the cover of the well that we may come by the water, even as Jacob rolled away the stone from the mouth of the well, by which means the flocks of Laban were watered. Indeed, without translation into the vulgar tongue, the unlearned are but like children at Jacob's well, which was deep, without a bucket or something to draw with. Or, as that person mentioned by Isaiah, to whom when a sealed book was delivered with this motion, read this, I pray thee, he was fain to make this answer, I cannot, for it is sealed. Does all this sound like a group of people who'd be happy with a situation in which Bible readers have to use dictionaries and other helps to understand words for which there are existing equivalents in the reader's own speech? Let me make this super concrete. Just because the King James translators used the word "the" after it had mostly faded out of common speech, but was still understandable, doesn't mean that they would insist that the word bold, B-O-L-L-E-D, not be replaced with in bloom, or that false friends such as halt not be replaced with limp. In fact, I am certain, given everything I know about the King James translators, that they would not refuse to allow their work to be revised to keep up with changes in the English language, to stay accessible to the very vulgar. I've read their preface too often and too carefully. It starts with a lengthy defense of the validity of Bible translation revision. I believe that the King James translators would be greatly alarmed by Ross's King James Only viewpoint. And I think they'd sniff out the false choice presented by Ross's second new argument. Well, maybe newish. I've heard this basic argument before too, but not put in quite the same way that Ross does, so I'm choosing to call it new and to answer it.
But Dr. White's argument would lead his audience to conclude that the KJV translators taught that the Bible must be at the lowest level of language currently spoken. And that was not at all what the KJV preface affirmed.
What is the lowest level of language? I'm not sure. I think perhaps that Ross has in mind street language, slang, or maybe texting abbreviations. Maybe hillbilly English like from Mater in cars. King James Onlyists raise texting and urban slang especially as the terrible boogeymen to be avoided in Bible translation. I've many times heard these brothers warn that that's where modern scholars want to take the Bible. But this is a false choice. Effectively all King James Onlyists, in my experience, talk about English as only high and low. They see it on a vertical line, a y-axis. They forget that English also exists on an x-axis, a horizontal line, a timeline. Ross presents a choice between high English and the lowest level of language currently spoken. I say that there are multiple other options, and the most important one is what we actually see when people like me propose alternatives to the King James. We don't see texting Bibles or slang Bibles. Take a look at one of my favorite translations, the NASB. It's not dummy English. It's not the lowest level of English currently spoken, not even close. I love the NASB, but I actually think its English is sometimes too high, which is why I don't use it exclusively in ministry. There are some examples of Biblish in the NASB, and though I love it, I don't deny this fact. The NASB says, for example, "For I see that you are in the gall of bitterness and in the bondage of iniquity." That's not dummy English, not street English, not slang. The NASB says, "For I was envious of the arrogant as I saw the prosperity of the wicked." That's not the lowest level of English. The NASB says, "But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises." When modern translators translate God's word into modern English, do they produce the lowest level of English? I think not. Really, all I'm asking for is for the King James's archaic word in Romans 13, chambering, to be replaced with the NASB's contemporary words, sexual promiscuity. People today don't know what chambering is. They know what sexual promiscuity is. That's not dummy English. I'm not asking for the translation to be shacking up, because that's not the literary register that Paul was writing in. I don't know of a single translation that does that. King James Onlyists talk about all English translations as if they're the wildest parts of the message. Of course, even the lowest level of language is still astonishingly subtle and complex, and even rule-based. I've heard preachers with very, very thick accents that I won't name say very witty and brilliant things. I've heard them speak with incredible eloquence. The maxillofacial surgeon who took out my wisdom teeth when I was 19 had a really deep southern accent, Let me tell you, he was no dummy. I don't think we should be too quick to dismiss the linguistic validity of languages and dialects that sound dumb to us. I say this with a few very specific languages in mind. One is Hawaiian Pidgin, which is mostly but not entirely English. I've heard many King James Onlyists mock this Bible translation into Hawaiian Pidgin, but it's a real language used by real people. And if it is, God can speak that language. The Bible can be translated into any genuine language, including ours. I'm not asking for high English or low English, really, just contemporary English. Intelligible with effort is okay. Where the Hebrew and Greek are high, use higher and more literary, but still contemporary English. Where they are lower, use more accessible, but still contemporary English. That's all. Ross turns in his video now to an argument that I've handled repeatedly and in detail, the idea that second-person pronouns in the King James are supremely accurate and must be preserved at all costs. He goes on at some length, but with no apparent awareness of anything that I've written or said. No advance in the discussion. In fairness, he put this video out before my King James Bible Study project was released, which is, I think, the last word on the matter. Unless he comes up with a response, I refer him to this project, KJV-studyproject.com. Third new argument. Ross goes on to talk about why the King James is not Old English or Middle English. I've heard this before, but I don't remember responding to it. It will require only a brief response.
People who need to be better informed say that the King James Version is Old English. Well, what is Old English? Beowulf is Old English. So is the KJV easier to understand than that? I think so. A lot easier, right? So the King James Version is not Old English. Beowulf is Old English. Old English is incomprehensible. King James Bible is not Old English. Well, is the KJV Middle English? Now, I had a whole semester to study Chaucer in the English program at UC Berkeley as an undergraduate. And so I'm going to read to you the introduction from Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And so this is what Middle English sounds like. And so you listen to this and tell me if this is easier or harder to understand than the King James Version. One that April, with his sure sorte, the drucht of March hath persa to the rote, and bathed every vine in switchly one that day were sick. So that's Middle English. That's the beginning of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Now, unlike the incomprehensible Old English, you could probably pick out some words here or there of the Middle English. And if you see Middle English written down, you will be able to figure out more than you could figure out by just listening to it. So Middle English is certainly closer to modern English than is incomprehensible Old English. But is the King James Version easier to understand than Chaucer's Middle English, technically late Middle English? Well, certainly. The KJV is definitely easier to understand than Chaucer's Middle English. So the King James Version is not Old English. It is not Middle English. It is modern English.
Now, this is all true and accurate, but I don't think it adds up to the conclusion that Ross is driving at. Slow evolutions like language change are hard to pin dates on. When did the Middle Ages begin? When did the Renaissance begin? There are symbolic dates, but the people of the Middle Ages lived very different lives in 500 at the beginning than they did in 1500 at the end of the period. Likewise in language, 1611 is as good a date as any to begin the modern English phase, but that doesn't mean that the English of the very beginning of this era is perfectly intelligible to people 500 years later on the timeline, the x-axis. Perhaps future historians will mark a change in English in the year 2000 after the internet achieved wide adoption. Perhaps we are, unbeknownst to ourselves, living in what future linguists will see as a new era of English. I don't know. I honestly don't think so. What I do know is that dozens or hundreds of words, constructions, and punctuation rules that are used in the King James are no longer fully intelligible to contemporary English speakers. I have demonstrated this beyond doubt in my 50 False Friends series here on YouTube. Ross might say the King James uses modern English, so you ought to be able to understand it. But that didn't work for me. Growing up, I understood King James English better than the average person, I assume, just by long exposure to it, and I was a pretty good reader and speller. But I had no idea how many words I was misunderstanding because of language change. Now I think I have a better picture. My King James Bible Study project suggests rather strongly that King James only pastors have the same problems with King James English that I did. I've seen a lot of King James onlyists who think that they're making a slam dunk point when they show that the King James isn't Old English, but instead modern English. But I, myself, Mark Ward, have never made the elementary scientific labeling mistake that they're combating. What matters to me is not the label, but the substance. Whatever you want to call King James English, Elizabethan, Jacobean, modern, I don't care. We don't speak or write this English anymore. Our English overlaps with King James English, sure, but it's different enough to cause a great number of misunderstandings for contemporary King James readers. I think I've shown this. Proclaiming the King James to be modern doesn't wipe away the nearly 100 false friends that I've talked about here on the channel. That's it for this first video. All three of these arguments from Thomas Ross were more newish than new. In the next video, though, we will talk about an argument from Ross that I must admit really is new to me. And in the third video of this series, we will talk about two arguments that are genuinely creative, genuinely new, that forced me to do some real homework, especially one of them. I think you'll find these very interesting. I mean, by definition, you are still here, which means you are some kind of nerd. It takes one to know one. And I know you, fellow nerd. I warn you that I might have to pretend not to know you when the jocks are around, because I also like sports and I need to hang out with the dudes on my team. I cannot be seen being too kind to nerds. But after football practice is over, I will put my glasses on again and head out under the cover of darkness to Language Nerd Club. And you will forgive me for any unpleasant nerd-jock interactions in which I participated during daylight hours during school. High school is a hard place. We all have to do what we can to survive.